Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're going to go ahead and get started. You are attending the Community Outdoor Outreach Program's Grant Writing Workshop. So we're going to talk about everything that you're going to need to apply for what we call a co-op grant. And we wanted to start off with some introductions today. So my name is Carly Blankenship. I'm the grant manager for the co-op program. I've been with the agency for about 7 years now, working with the grant program the entire time. So I've met many of you, and a lot of you are new, and we really look forward to hearing more about your programs. And we also have Jessica as well. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning. I'm Jessica Legallo, and I'm a grant coordinator with the co-op program. I've been with the program a couple years now. Prior to that, I was with the agency in our outdoor education and outreach program. So some of you might know me from our Texas Outdoor Family program or our Buffalo Soldier program. I'm going to be hosting the second part of the workshop today, and we look forward to supporting your application.
All right, and I wanted to start off with a few just logistics for this webinar. Today we have everybody muted, so you won't be able to talk at all, but you are able to use the questions tab on your little control panel for GoToWebinar. So if you just open up the questions link, you can enter in questions there that will be sent to us, and we'll communicate you to everyone through that questions tab. We also have a number of handouts available today. So there are 5 handouts listed under the handout section of GoToWebinar. And I believe these were also emailed to each person who registered for the event. So you should have these in your email as well. A lot of these documents are going to include all the information for everything we're going to talk about today. So we have the actual co-op grant application in our handout. We have the presentation that we're presenting to you today, so you don't have to furiously scribble notes. You do have a copy of that presentation if you need it. And that presentation will also be included in our resources page in our grant management system. You also have the approved TPWD relationships that we're going to go over in part 2, talking about all the different TPWD relationships that are options to be incorporated for your grant. And that document also has a number of live links in it that bring you directly to that program's website or the reservation website or phone numbers for reservations and so on. Next up, we have the co-op program guidance. This lists all of the rules and requirements for the co-op grant program. So in part 1 of the program, a lot of that information is going to be found in the program guidance document. And then last up, we have the application prep and practice booklet. In part 2, we're going to be going through the actual application itself, and we're going to be practicing some of the things to make sure that you're fully prepared to submit the application. So those 5 handouts are available. And for this particular presentation, the first half is really going to be an overview about the program. We're going to talk about eligibility, what you can and can't do in the program, what types of expenses are allowable versus not allowable. We're also going to talk about the scoring criteria. And then we're going to go through and walk through the Recreation Grants Online system, which is our grant management system where you'll actually be submitting and managing the grant applications. Then we're going to take a 10-minute break. And then Jessica's going to start with part 2, going over the specific questions of the application, and we're going to walk through each and every question on the application and provide tips and guidance on how to complete those sections of the application. So if you have questions at any time, go ahead and use that questions function. We definitely want this to be an interactive presentation. Jessica and my job is we're here to help you out. And so please don't be hesitant on reaching out to us if you have any questions at all. And with that, let's go ahead and get started today. So the purpose of the co-op grants, we are here to provide grant funding to any tax-exempt organization for programming that engages underrepresented audiences in everything TPWD. So we're talking about outdoor recreation, conservation, and environmental education activities. This program's been around since 1996, so we've been operational for about 27 or 28 years now. And there's no federal grant funding tied to this program at all. It is all state funds. And for this particular grant program, we use a portion of what's collected on the sporting goods sales tax. So anytime organizations buy kayaks or camping gear, hunting gear, fishing gear, all of that, those types of expenses, a portion of those funds come back to support this program and our other state park initiatives as well. Since 1996, we've also given away 863 grants, and that amounts to a little over $27 million. So we've had a pretty big reach across the whole state of Texas. Next up, we're going to talk about the priorities for this grant program. And this information can also be found in the program guidance document on page 3. I'm not going to go through each individual one, but essentially this program's focus is on engaging underrepresented audiences. And we're going to go into what that means a little bit later on, but essentially our 4 target demographics are low income, female, minority, and individuals with a disability. So we're engaging those underrepresented audiences in everything outdoor recreation. So facilitating access to all of TPWD's sites, engaging participants in environmental education and connecting them with TPWD's education programs that we have available, and engaging participants in conservation, so citizen science programs, or developing the next generation of natural resource leaders. So a few grant details. This year we have about $2.5 to $3 million available. And because we have more money available, we were able to increase the cap of what you can apply for this program. So this is a change from previous years. The minimum request needs to be at least $5,000, and you can apply for up to $100,000 for an 18-month grant period. It used to be a cap of about $60,000 or $70,000, so we were able to up that amount. I know that the cost of personnel and the cost of outdoor recreation equipment alone has increased significantly. So we want to provide you with the resources needed to run your programs. For this program, reimbursement is the preferred method for payment, which means that you would need to purchase those items up front, and then you would submit a reimbursement request to us where you provide the receipt or invoices, as well as the proof of payment documentation. And then once that's been reviewed, we'll reimburse you for the amount that was expended. But we do have an advance option available to those organizations who qualify for an advance. And so if you qualify for an advance, meaning that you're not high risk and there's some other factors as well, then you'll be eligible for a short-term advance. So that's up to 3 months worth of expenses. And you would still need to provide all of the documentation for that advance, so all of those receipts, invoices, and proof of payment, but you would just provide that. You would receive the money up front, and then you would provide that information on the back end before you can request any additional payments. So we do have those options available. For this program, we have a November 1 deadline. This is a really hard deadline of 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. So all applications must be submitted in our grant management system before 5 p.m. on November 1st. This is a very hard deadline. There's no exceptions. And so if you're working on the grant application at the last minute, you will actually lose privileges to submit your grant application right at 5 p.m. So please do not wait until the last minute. I recommend submitting your application at least a day in advance to make sure there's no issues. It is a long application. Our budget can take a while to fill out. So we want to make sure that you're starting in plenty of time to get this submitted before the November 1 application. This is a competitive grant program. We cannot fund all of the applications that we receive. We typically receive at least 75 applications, and we have quite a bit of interest this year, so that might go up. And on a normal fully funded year, we can fund anywhere between 40 and 50 organizations, depending on what the average request amount. So very competitive program, which is why we need to stay really hard on that November 1st deadline with no exceptions. And then we'll be reviewing the grant applications after the deadline, and we'll announce to all participants or applicants on March 1 if you receive a grant or if you don't. You'll receive a notification either way on the morning of March 1 through our grant management system. Eligibility for this program, you can find more detailed information for eligibility on page 4 of the program guidance. But essentially, you need to be a non-political tax-exempt organization. So you can be a nonprofit, a municipality, so a city or a county, a university, an ISD or a school. You can be a church group, anybody who is tax-exempt. You also need to be in good standing with the Texas Comptroller and the federal government. And we refer to SAM, that's System for Award Management. That is the system that the federal government uses, so where you can research who's in good standing and who's not. So you must be in good standing with both of those entities, which essentially means that you've submitted all your documentation and you do not owe any taxes or any other payments to the state of Texas or the federal government. In your application, you're also required to submit a signed resolution at the time of submittal. And I really want to emphasize to any cities or counties, this signed resolution must be submitted by the November 1st deadline. And so if your city council or any other entities that might take a while to sign those and you have to get on their docket, just make sure that you do all of that work now so that it's fully signed and you can submit it by the November 1st deadline. But this resolution essentially gives the authority for your organization to submit this, this proposal for the grant. And so we do have some templates available both for nonprofits and for municipalities that you can use, but you're essentially giving authority to submit the grant application and then letting us know who the primary point of contact would be for this grant. Continuing with eligibility, anybody who has received a past grant in this last funding cycle, so if you are awarded a grant in March of 2023, you will not be eligible to come in this round. You need to wait at least until the next grant funding cycle, as you cannot have multiple grants at the same time for this grant. And then in addition, we can only accept one grant award per entity. So you cannot submit 2 to 3 different proposals, hoping that maybe one of them is awarded. You really need to narrow down which proposal might be the most competitive, or you can combine those proposals into one joint application that you're going to be submitting to us. So only one grant award and only one grant application per entity. And the last eligibility function is that your organization must have at least one direct relationship to Texas Parks and Wildlife. And that document that we attached in the handout section for approved TPWD relationships goes over what all the eligible relationships could be. We consider the 3 primary categories to be: 1, visiting any TPWD owned and operated facility, or 2, incorporating one of our TPWD education and outreach programs into your programming with participants, or 3, having one of TPWD's staff engage directly with your participants. So we have a number of different game wardens or wildlife biologists or other staff who are often happy to come out and lead some programming for you or talk about their career. Those are all of the eligible relationships for this particular program. A few things that don't really count as eligible relationships that we do see sometimes are that if you have applied to and received one of the other grants in our department, so we have a lot of other grant programs that are mainly construction programs, like a local parks grant program or a target range or boating access or a trails grant. Just the fact that you received the grant and are working on one of those projects does not count as a relationship for this particular grant program. We're really talking about the impact directly to participants. So just the fact that you had a target range grant, for example, that will not count as that direct relationship to TPWD. We really need more of a direct connection with your participants. And we're really trying to diverse the audiences engaged with our agency. So we want to make sure that your participants are familiar with all of the offerings that our agency has. A few of the other things we tend to see are that somebody might have a license through a different department of our agency, and that doesn't really count as that relationship either because, again, the participants are not directly involved with that relationship. We're going to go over all of the different offerings that we have in part 2 of this section. So we're going to go over the TPWD relationships in depth in part 2, but please keep that in mind. Not all activities in your grant proposal have to be related to Texas Parks and Wildlife. You can go to different nature centers or a zoo that was not offered by us, or go camp at an LCRA facility or a local park facility. You can do all of those things in this grant. We just want to make sure that you understand that you must have at least one direct relationship to Texas Parks and Wildlife in your proposal. Next up, we're going to talk about the supported and ineligible activities for this grant, and these can be found on page 4 of the program guidance. Essentially, this is everything that you would associate with Texas Parks and Wildlife. So archery, camping, conservation projects, cultural resources, environmental science, trail riding, fishing, mountain biking, outdoor cooking, rock climbing, hunting, all of those things that you would associate with Texas Parks and Wildlife. This is not an exhaustive list, so if there's something else that you really want to include in your grant application, by all means, reach out to Jessica and myself, and we can tell you if that would be an eligible activity. Things that are not eligible through this grant include construction projects and exhibits. So within our recreation grants branch at Texas Parks and Wildlife, we have a number of different grant programs. Co-op is the only program-only grant. So we really want to just fund programming, and we cannot fund any infrastructure or construction projects. We have a lot of other grant programs like our Target Range grant, our Local Parks grant, Boating Access grant, and our Trails grant program. Those are all construction programs, and so for this particular program, no construction projects or exhibits are allowed. This is also the Community Outdoor Outreach program. So indoor classroom only projects are not eligible. So if you're a school group and you really just want to focus on the activities that are happening in a classroom, unfortunately, that would not be eligible. That does not mean that you cannot have indoor classroom functions in your proposal. You can by all means have a segment of that is an indoor classroom learning opportunity, but we also want you to have that direct hands-on outdoor exposure with your participants as well. So there needs to be a component to the outdoors for your participants. So just keep that in mind. No general landscaping or vegetable gardens are allowed. That just doesn't really align with the goal of this grant. Our state requirements also require that we can't assist any marketing campaigns or advertising expenses for your organization. And with this grant program, all of the activities must be within the state of Texas, so no out-of-state travel with participants. There is an exception here, however. If you need to do training for your staff or your volunteers and that training is not offered in the state of Texas, we will support all of those training expenses and travel expenses, hotel expenses for that out-of-state travel, as long as that training aligns with the direct activities of your grant. So we will do out-of-state travel for training. A few others that we commonly see is we do not allow you to host any sort of community festival or any general public event that's open to the general public. This could be Earth Day festivals or any other big festival where it's just open to the entire public and they can go around and do all the different learning activities. The reason being for this grant is that we're going to require you to estimate the demographics for the participants engaged. And if you receive a grant, you'll be required to report on those demographics as well. And we find it very difficult for these big special events that are open to the general public. It's really difficult to estimate who your target audience will be on the day of the event. And most of the time, you're not able to collect that information. So for this particular grant, We do not allow any of those big special events that are open to the general public. Same with hosting a tournament or competitive event. You can attend somebody else's tournament or competitive event, but you cannot host your own. And this gets a little bit more complicated with program income, as a lot of times you need to charge quite a bit of money for those competitions. And so if you have, let's say, an archery program where you're going to be engaging participants in year-round practices with archery, and then you also want to send them to some competitions, that is perfectly allowed. You're just not able to host your own competition or tournament. And then last, those traditional sports and fitness programs like baseball, soccer, football, those are not eligible through this program. They just don't align with the intent of our grant program. We really want it to be more focused on outdoor recreation, environmental education, and conservation. Now let's talk about eligible expenses for co-op, and these are all outlined on page 9 of the program guidance document. And we'll talk about all of the different types of expenses that are eligible and then some that are not eligible as well. The first up that we commonly see are personnel and contractors. There's a wide definition of what is allowable under this particular category, but this includes all of your salary personnel, your hourly personnel, full-time, part-time, temporary staff. If you need to hire a specific contractor, a few different types of contractors are eligible. So if you need to hire a year-long contractor to run some programming, that is eligible. Or if you just need a contractor to come out, a rock climbing expert, let's say, that's going to come out for 4 hours to lead a program with you, and you don't have the internal staff that have the certifications to run that type of programming, you can hire a contractor to come out and lead those activities with your participants. So we will, all of those are definitely allowable. And then we will also allow any sort of, if you're working with a teacher program, we will allow the extra duty pay for your teachers. And then we also allow something like paid internships as well. And then next up, we have food and travel. Oh, one more thing I wanted to mention on personnel and contractors is that if you do include staff on your budget, just keep in mind that in order to receive payment for those expenses, you're going to be required to submit either a timesheet or an invoice for that contractor. So if your organization does not currently have timesheets or invoices for contractors, just keep in mind that once the grant begins, you must have those in place. And we do have some templates that you could use for timesheets if needed. Next up is food and travel. We'll pay for all the food for eligible activities in this program. So if you need to buy groceries, or if you're going to take participants to a restaurant, or if you need to buy box lunches, all of those, or per diem, all of those expenses are eligible. We'll also include your travel expenses. So we'll pay for the gas or mileage for this program, or if you need to rent a vehicle or a trailer or a truck, we will pay for those rental expenses associated with travel. The only thing we will not pay for in this instance is purchasing a vehicle. So you're not able to purchase a van or a truck or a car for this particular event, but you are eligible to purchase a trailer if needed. Next up are fees. We will pay for all of those program fees or entrance fees to state parks or to other locations like a nature center or a zoo. If you have lodging associated with that, so if you're going to be camping out at a park, we'll pay for all of those expenses, whether it's a campsite or a cabin or a shelter, we'll pay for all of those. If you need a hotel for your staff or your participants, and you can justify why you need a hotel, that's definitely eligible as well. Just keep in mind that if you're an organization who provides a certain program to the public, you cannot request just a lump sum for what that cost would be. We won't pay you for that lump sum. We instead want to see those direct expenses for your program. So if you wanted to honor a scholarship or anything, you can still do scholarships. Just when seeking reimbursement from us, you have to include the actual expenses. We will not do a per participant lump sum payment to your organization. Training is also included in this section. So if you need to train your staff or volunteers, or maybe even if you want to train your participants, if it's in a youth development program and you want to send them through our angler education program or our hunter education program, you can do that as well. But just make sure all of that training is directly related to supported grant activities. So if it's training that's not related, we're not going to pay for. But if you need to get ACA certified or rock climbing certified, first aid, all of those things are eligible for this program. And last up in that section, we will pay for participant liability insurance. That is the only type of insurance we will cover in this grant. And if you have multiple programs within your organization, but we're only supporting, let's say, one of those programs, you will need to prorate that liability insurance just to the programs that we are supporting. But we will pay for that general participant liability insurance. However, we will not pay for any directors and officers insurance or vehicle insurance through this grant. And then if you have any sort of outdoor service project or conservation project included in your grant activities, we will pay for all of the expenses associated with that. So native plants, or shovels, or gloves, mulch, all of those things we'll pay for. The only thing to keep in mind is that this is Texas Parks and Wildlife, and we can only pay for native plants. We cannot pay for the cost of any invasive or adapted plant. They all must be native plants. And then last up, the biggest section that we see is for supplies and equipment. And so we will pay for all of those supplies that you need to run that program. And for those, we typically see like outdoor recreation gear, like all of your fishing or hunting, your kayaks, your camping gear, all of those things are definitely eligible. Your outdoor cooking supplies, we'll pay for all of that gear. If you're working with individuals with a disability, we'll also pay for that adaptive equipment associated to those organizations. So if you need something like hand cycles or any of the additional supporting things for hunting and shooting sports or archery, we'll pay for all of that adaptive equipment. I know some of that can get really pricey. Next up, we'll pay for all of the computers and electronics associated to your program. So if you have a program coordinator that's working directly just on this project, we'll pay for something like a computer for them, or iPads, or any other tablets that your participants are going to be using. We'll also pay for things like drones. We do have some projects that are incorporating participant learning and development with drones, so that would be an eligible expense. Any of those environmental education materials like water testing supplies, microscopes, telescopes, those education trunks, which you can either include as the individual items or you can buy those in bulk that are already prepared for. All of those are eligible. And then last up, any of the safety gear that you need to run your program. So if you need to buy first aid kits or water bottles, hats, t-shirts for identification, all of that safety gear is eligible. Next up are all the items that you are not able to purchase with a grant. These are also found in the program guidance section. I believe on page 9 is when we start talking about all of the different expenses. Unfortunately, we can't pay for any sort of advertising or marketing expenses. We have an asterisk on curriculum development design. If that is just a small portion of your grant, we will absolutely pay for that. But if the majority of your project is just on curriculum development and design, we really want the focus of the grant proposal to be on the direct activities with your participants. So if the majority of expenses are curriculum development and design, they won't be allowable. We really want the majority of expenses to be on the actual work directly with participants. Like I mentioned earlier, we can't support exhibits or construction. If you have general grounds maintenance for your site, we cannot support the cost of all of that. This is a state program, so the cost of gratuity or sales tax is not allowed. We do not allow any indirect expenses for this program. So if you work with an umbrella organization or a university and they absolutely require that you have an indirect cost rate or a certain percentage for indirect cost, Unfortunately, the grant itself will not pay for those funds. You need to come up with some sort of outside funds to pay for those expenses. Any sort of office space or property leasing or any sort of rental for your storage, your buildings, your boat or vehicle storage, none of that is allowed through this grant. However, you can pay for a trailer, and that could be a covered trailer that you store things in, but you also take to events. That would be eligible through this program. I had mentioned earlier, we will not pay you a lump sum for scholarships for individuals to attend your program for free. You can still offer scholarships for free attendance. By all means, we encourage that. Just in our payment method to you, we want to pay for the individual expenses rather than a lump sum scholarship amount to your organization. And then the last couple things I wanted to mention are supplies purchased with this grant program must stay with the grant. So you are not able to purchase, let's say, a bunch of fishing gear, tackle boxes, camping gear, and then give it to your participants to keep. You can purchase those things, but those items must stay with the program for future use. And this goes back to some state grant requirements that certain individuals cannot benefit directly for things that are purchased with grant funds. And so those must remain with the program for them to be continued to use by the program. There are a few exceptions with this rule, especially related to safety supplies. So if you need to buy t-shirts or water bottles or sunglasses, bandanas, those kinds of things where you're working in the middle of the summer with participants and they're for safety, those types of t-shirts and water bottles can be given to participants, but any of that outdoor recreation gear cannot. And then last up, we will not support the purchase of vehicles or motorboats for this particular grant. We would love to in the future, but that's just not an option right now. If you want to buy like a kayak or a little John boat, because you're going to take a couple kids out there that doesn't have a motor, that's allowable, but any sort of big motorboat or vehicle are not allowed. And we also will not allow the vehicle maintenance associated to that. Next up, I wanted to go over the timeline of this grant. So applications are currently open now. They opened on August 1st of 2023. The upcoming application deadline is that hard deadline of November 1st, 2023 at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. We will announce grant awards on March 1st of 2024. So just keep in mind that if you don't receive any notifications in our grant management system, that's going to be our method of communicating who received a grant and who did not. So make sure that when you submit your application, if you did not receive that confirmation email, there may be some sort of issue to where maybe there's a firewall issue, and talk to us. We can do some test emails and we'll have our systems administrator work with your organization to make sure that you are receiving those emails. They're commonly sent to your spam or clutter folder, so just take a look in there first, and if they're in there, make sure to mark them as not spam or clutter. And then if your organization receives a grant, we will be hosting a grant management webinar. This will be online webinar. You do not have to travel to Austin for this workshop, but that'll be scheduled in late March. It will also be recorded if you're not able to attend that particular meeting. And in that, we're going to be talking about all of the reporting requirements, how to submit a payment request, the requirements that are going to be listed on your grant agreement. We'll go through all of the management logistics to manage this grant. When applying to this grant program, you'll need to make sure that all activities and expenses take place during the period of performance that will be listed on the grant agreement. And that will be on March 1st of 2024. That period of performance will begin. It'll be the same day as deadline day. And then that will go through 18 months until September 1st of 2025. So please make sure that all activities that are proposed fall within that 18-month period of time. If we see activities or purchases that are before that March 1st date, those will all be disallowed. And if you have activities that are planned in March, but you purchased expenses in January or February, we will not reimburse you for those purchases spent before March 1st. Same thing with after the September 1st, 2025 deadline. If you have activities that go beyond that date, we're going to remove those and any associated expenses from your grant proposal. And then if you receive a grant, you'll be required to do quarterly reports. Your first report will be due on July 30th of 2024, and then they'll be due quarterly until the grant finishes for that particular period of performance. At the end of that grant, you'll be required to submit a comprehensive final report no later than 45 days after that grant period ends. And here you're going to provide all the activities that were completed and supported by this grant. Next up, I wanted to talk about the scoring criteria that we use. And you can find specific information on page 6 of the program guidance document. And just keep in mind that if you are having trouble finding the program guidance document, if you click on the main thing for GoToWebinar, there is a handout section there that we have 5 handouts for this webinar. You should have also received an email that includes these handouts, and I'm going to show you a little bit later that you can access all of these documents through the resources section of our grant management online system. So our scoring criteria, all of the grant proposals that come in are reviewed by an internal scoring committee that we have. They're all of our subject matter experts. And so they use this scoring criteria. I'm not going to go through everything that's listed on page 6 of the program guidance. You can read that yourself. However, I will go over the big categories. It's out of 100 points, and 15 points of that are focused on how well your proposal aligns with co-op priorities. So are you doing the type of activities we want to see? Are you engaging the audiences that are targeted for this grant? There's 15 points associated with that. Next up, we have 30 points focused on, are you engaging our underrepresented audiences that we identified? So how well are you engaging them? You don't have to meet all 4 of those demographics. We have very few projects who actually meet all of our demographics. However, you're going to be really judged on how well you're meeting those. If you're only serving 20% of a particular, of just one of those categories, you might not score as well if somebody's serving 80% low-income audiences, and so on. Another 30 points will be focused on the expected impact to your participants. So this is a big range, but essentially we give a little bit more preference to those projects who are going to have longer in-depth exposure to those participants, and that those participants are likely to continue some of these activities. And so if we have a project where you're only engaging, 1,000 participants, but they're just engaged for about an hour, it might not score as well compared to a project that is engaging participants multiple times over several month grant period. So just kind of keep that in mind. That doesn't mean that one-time programs are not accepted. We allow and fund many one-time programs, but there's a big range there. And so we evaluate on the overall expected impact to your participants. Next up, there's 20 points associated to the timeline and budget. We want to make sure that you understand and that you have a very well-developed program, and all of those activities are listed on the timeline and they align with what you included in the narrative and the budget. We want to make sure that all of those sections in the application are consistent and aligned and are as well developed as they can be. We also want to make sure that you are proposing things that are eligible versus non-eligible. So keep in mind that if you include items on your budget that are ineligible, so let's say you put $40,000 in the budget to purchase a vehicle, we will remove that amount from the awarded budget, and you will not have the opportunity to replace it with a different line item. We will just deduct that amount from your grant award. So please pay attention to the eligible and ineligible expenses for this program. And if you have any questions about if something would be eligible or if you're doing something the right way on the budget, by all means, please contact Jessica or myself, and we can give you some guidance on that. We cannot review your entire budget or any major section of the application for you. That's not fair to the other applicants, but we are definitely happy to walk through and talk to you about what your what types of things you're submitting, how competitive it might be, and if you would be eligible. And then last up on the scoring criteria, we have organizational capacity. We want to make sure that you have all of the qualified staff to run your program and that you're going to continue similar activities. So we don't want to purchase $50,000 worth of outdoor recreation gear that will then never be used again. We want to make sure there's some sort of sustainability component included. Now I want to talk about some of these organizational capacity tips, and these are just tips that we've learned over time from projects who have struggled. And we really want to be very open and honest about some of the real struggles that some groups can have in the implementation part of their grant. So first up is the timeline and spring of 2024 events. Like we mentioned earlier, the grant awards will be announced on March 1st. You will not know before that date if you received a grant or not. So please keep in mind that if you're coordinating something like a spring break event or some sort of activities during spring break, you're not going to be notified until March 1st if you received a grant. So if you have other grant funds that you're using, so if you're not able to receive grant fundings through us and you have something else, that might work out for your organization. However, if you're relying on this particular grant award to determine if you're going to be hiring staff or purchasing certain expenses for that you need to purchase in advance, that may not work out because you cannot purchase anything until that March 1 date. And also, if you need something like an advance, it can take up to 30 days for payments to hit your bank account as long as all information is received. So we cannot issue a payment until we get your grant agreement in place. So just think about all of those things. That might take a couple weeks and then a couple more weeks to receive your payment. So you might not have your first payment until April. So just kind of keep those logistics in mind. Maybe it's better to do a summer grant or summer program or the following spring. Another thing to consider is that these are state government funds, and there's some red tape that comes along with that. We have to do our checks and balances to minimize risk. So with each payment, whether it's a reimbursement or an advance, you're going to be required to submit proof of payment and those individual receipts or invoices that you had for each expense. On the advance, you'll submit those receipts on the back end, and on a reimbursement expense, you'll submit them on the front end. But no matter what, you're going to be required to do that, and it can be time intensive to compile all of that documentation together. So just keep in mind if you have the internal organizational capacity to manage a grant. Unfortunately, we're not like a foundation where we just give you all of the funds up front. I also want to expand on the administrative burden for small organizations. You are going to be required to submit quarterly reports, a comprehensive final report. If you claim certain demographics, you will be required to report on the demographics of participants who actually showed up to your program. So you're going to have a way of documenting those demographics for your participants, submitting all of that information about all of the activities completed. So just think about if your organization has the ability to do all of that. The grant will support the direct personnel expenses for compiling all of those reimbursements, or compiling those quarterly or final reports. So we will pay for the staff associated with that as we consider that to be direct. But just think about if you have that capacity. Another item that is a really big deal, especially as we're dealing with outdoor programs, are weather and cancellations. So outdoor programming, it's hot in the summer. We have things like hurricanes and tropical storms that come by. Sometimes park sites shut down for extended periods if a hurricane comes through. So just think about all of those different things, have backup plans. So if you had a huge rain event that came through and canceled those, if you said you were going to do 5 campouts, we're going to hold you to those 5 campouts. So just make sure that you have some backup plans that if certain events were canceled, or if you couldn't recruit enough people for that event, we're going to hold you to what you proposed in the grant application. The same thing goes with TPWD availability, and I think this is relevant for your organization's staffing as well. Just like many organizations, and if not more than organizations, Texas Parks and Wildlife has a lot of staff turnover, especially in our parks. Interpreters change, different park staff change, program people change. It's just one of those things, and it's a long hiring process for us. So if you had a commitment from an individual and then that person leaves, there might not be anybody to honor that commitment, or a new person might come in and may not have the capacity to run that program for you. When those things happen, or if a certain park is closed down for whatever reason, we are going to try to work with you to come up with alternatives, but you really need to consider that in your grant proposal and really under promise and over deliver with those types of things to give yourself some leeway in case those partnerships fall through, or your organization is going through a staff changing, or TPWD is going through a staff change. So just keep that in mind. Again, we cannot emphasize enough to plan conservatively, under promise, over deliver, because whatever is put into your grant proposal will be translated into your grant agreement. And last up, I want to talk about your grant agreement compliance and then deductions. So like I said, anything that you propose in the grant agreement will be tied over and put into your specific grant agreement, and we're going to hold you to that. There is some flexibility. I know, certain parks don't work out, they don't have reservations available, so you go to a different park. Timelines can change. We understand all of that happens, and we are definitely going to work with you. But if your scope of work said you were going to do an after-school program plus 5 campouts, we're going to hold you to an after-school program and 5 campouts. And we're going to work with you as best as we can to make those connections with alternatives if something does fall through. But you really need to keep in mind that you must do what you said you were going to do. And if by the end of the grant you are not able to complete most of those components, there might be some compliance issues, and then you might have a deduction. If you decide to come in for the grant, you would have a deduction for the next round because you didn't meet the requirements of the past grant. So if you have any questions about those or want to talk to us about your specific situations for those events, by all means, we'll definitely walk you through those. Next up, I'm going to actually walk you through the Recreation Grants Online system. We often refer to this as Argo, but we do not accept any paper applications. Everything is accepted in this particular system. This system has a very long URL, so it's really difficult unless you have this PowerPoint open to actually click on the link. You can do that. This is a live link in the PowerPoint. However, we find that the best way is to just Google TPWD co-op, and we are always the first thing that pops up. And so I'm going to go over creating a user account in the system. I'm going to go over where to find all of the different resources. I'm going to go over viewing the available opportunities and how to access the co-op grant application. And then I'll go over starting a co-op application and how to submit. So bear with me while I change my screen to our web browser. All right. So if you just Google co-op TPWD, like I said, we're always the first thing that pops up. You will come to our co-op's webpage. If you've ever been on Texas Parks and Wildlife's webpage and you're looking for something very specific, it can be a little bit hard to navigate, and co-op is definitely one of those programs. It's really hard to get to the co-op grant page from the main website. So our best recommendation is to just Google TPWD co-op. Our webpage is going to be the first thing that pops up. We have some of the FAQs about our grant programs, some of the deadlines, basic information about what we fund. And then if you want to view who has received a grant in the past few years, you can click on the news media section and see all of the old press releases that list everybody who received a grant, how much money they received, and a little blurb about their program. So if you want to just think about what other programs, what we funded in the past, that's a really highly recommended and great way to see what some of the other projects that have aligned with our grant program are. And then if you're ready to start an application, you can just click on this Apply Manage link, and then click on the link here for what we call Argo 2020, and that's our Recreation Grants Online system. Once you do that, you will come to this page. That's our general login page. There's a few things I want to show you from this area. First up, there's this resources section. You can access our resources whether you have a login or not, but there's a couple resources we wanted to show you. The first one is a quick start user guide area that will walk you through starting creating an account in the system for you, creating an organizational account, how to access the grant applications, how to add other users or remove other users, how to view and apply for grants, and so on. All of those different resources are found in a PDF or video in this particular section. They're really great resources if you're having a hard time getting started. From that page, we also have the Co-op grant program resources. This webinar will be recorded for future use, and probably early next week, that webinar will be listed in our resources page in case you want to check that out. But we have all of the handouts that were listed here can be found in our resources page. So we have budget samples, budget templates, examples for what an authorizing resolution would look like. We have past grant writing workshops. We have SMART goal guidance, example letters, our program guidance is listed here. So anything that you need that might be supporting information, we have in our grant resources section. So definitely make sure to check that out. And then from our main page, if you have not applied for a grant for the past 3 or so years, that means that you do not have a user account in our system. If you applied in a grant in our old system, those usernames did not carry through to our new system. So if you do not have an account, all you would do is click on this new user link, and then you would fill out your particular information for your account. If somebody else in your organization created an organization account, that means you're going to be listed in this drop-down menu, and then you would just pick your organization from that drop-down menu. If your organization is not listed there, then you would click this box for My Organization is Not Listed, and several other boxes pop down to where you can create your organization's account. So from here, you would put your organization's address, their website. If you're a nonprofit, well, you'll put their EIN number. If you're a government entity, you'll put your taxpayer ID. Whichever one that is not relevant to you, just enter 9s because these are all required accounts. So if you're a nonprofit, you enter your EIN number here, but then under the tax ID, you would just put a bunch of 9s. We're going to go through in section 2 more in-depth information about what we call a UEI. They used to be called DUNS numbers and SAM cage codes. We're going to go over that in more detail, but you are required to have what's called a unique entity identifier, and this is through the System for Award Management. It's a federal process, a federal website, and this is how we do checks to make sure that you're in good standing with the federal government. We're going to go over a lot more details about how to create an account for that in section 2. But here you will enter your UEI number in this section, and you can just put 9s in the DUNS. The DUNS is no longer relevant, and the same with the SAM code. If you have a SAM code, you can by all means put it in there. If you're in the process of applying for a UEI and you don't have it yet, you can always enter 9s in this section, and then before it's submitted, come back and enter your UEI number in here. And then also what I want to mention in this section is when you're completing your user account, or if you're adding other users, you can submit their role and the different roles for this organization. So if you want access to create an application or to submit an application or work later on payment requests or quarterly reports, you will need a sponsor administrator access. There are a few different access, like staff viewer, if you want people who want to be able to see the documents, but you don't want them to have any privileges on editing the documents, you can list them as a staff viewer. But if you want full access to create and submit an application, you are going to need that sponsor administrator role. So once you create your account here, you'll hit save, and then our sponsor administrator will approve your account. He's very quick on that. He's often reviews that the same day, so that's not going to be an issue for you. Once your account is created, then you'll be able to log into the system. And bear with me as I use my test account to log into the system. And I'll show you what it looks like once you're in. All right, once you log into the system, you'll come to this main page. If you're a system administrator, you'll be able to see the view opportunities here. From this section, just click on that view opportunities and all of the eligible grant programs that are open right now will pop up. So you'll just want to find the co-op grant program and then click on the apply now, and that will start your grant application. If you just wanted to look at it and then you're going to come back to it another time, to do that, you would just click on the apply now, but when you come back, you don't need to go to this view opportunities section because your application was already started. In fact, if you do that more than twice, you're not going to be able to view that opportunity anymore. So in that case, if you had already started an application and you wanted to save it and come back to it, your application will now be found in the My Tasks area of the system. You would just click on your My Tasks and then click on the link under name, and that will bring you to the actual application. I'm going to open up one here so you can see what our application looks like, but there are 6 different sections of the application. And so you would just click on each of these individual sections to get started. And we're going to go over in part 2 how to complete all of these individual sections, but you just fill that out. The one thing I really want to emphasize is that as you're working, the system can time out on you. So please make sure that you're hitting the save function frequently, at least every 10 to 15 minutes. If you don't do that, you run the risk of losing your information if the system times out. And this is really important, let's say in the budget section where it can take a long time to fill that out. Please make sure to save often. We do not want you to lose any of that information. Once all of your sections of your application are complete, you'll know that by seeing this little box with a pencil icon through it. If you just have a piece of paper with no pencil, that means that you have not started that section of the application. And if you have this hand, this red hand, that means you started it, but it is not complete yet. So make sure that all 6 sections have this piece of paper with a pencil on it. And then from that point, you can hover over the status change area at the top and then click application submitted. Once you submit that application, we should receive a notification that it came through. You should also receive a notification that your application was submitted. Again, if you do not receive that email, that means there was some sort of issue. Often they're sent to your spam or clutter folders, or maybe you have a firewall issue where you did not receive that. Since all of our communication is sent through this system, it's really important that you're receiving these emails. Otherwise, you will not know on March 1st if you received a grant or not. If you have any questions about creating an account or walking you through the actual application in Argo, you can either contact Jessica or myself, or Blake Powers is our system administrator. He's really wonderful and can help you step-by-step troubleshoot any problems that you might have. So please start that process early. I cannot emphasize enough how many times we see people starting applications on the deadline day or even in the afternoon of deadline day, and those applications rarely are submitted on time. It does take a while to go through the system. Go ahead and at least create a user account today and just open up the application so you can see what it looks like. Do that now. Again, start the UEI process right now so that you have that number by the November 1 deadline. And with that, we're going to go ahead and take about a 10-minute break. And so let's resume. We're going to put ourselves on mute. We will still be answering questions in the question section if you have them. But let's take a 10-minute break and we will return at 10:10. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, welcome back. We're going to jump into part 2. Carly, did you have a couple words of wisdom to share?
Yeah, we wanted to address a few of the questions that have been involved in the chat area. So we did have some questions on if having another grant in our department will affect your co-op grant. And we just wanted to let you know that if you have a trails grant or a local parks grant, target range grant, any of those, they do not affect your eligibility on applying to the co-op grant program. So if you have one of those, that does not affect whether you can come into this or not. So if you have another grant program, by all means, you're eligible for this program. The other thing I wanted to mention that we did not cover before is that this is a state grant program. It's not federal, so there's not quite as many red tape attached to it, but we do have to abide by some of the state grant rules from the Texas Comptroller. So if you're ever curious of what those rules are, things like conflict of interest policies or policies related to payments or advance payments or anything like that, please refer to what we call the Texas Grant TGMS, so Texas Grants Management Standards. And you can find that on the Comptroller website, or if you have trouble finding that, we can also include that in the resources section, or we'll email that directly to you. So if you've never had a state grant before and you're curious to look through that document of all those high-level requirements that we're invited to go by, that is called the Texas Grant Management Standards. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Jessica, and we're going to start walking through the actual application.
All right. Welcome to part 2 of our grant writing workshop. And this portion is going to cover the grant application process. We're going to start with a general overview of the application and then really take a deeper dive into some of the most critical elements of the grant application. I do want to mention, if you have applied to our grant program before, and whether you received a grant or not, we do highly encourage you to request a critique of your application. Once you request that critique, we'll go over your application and provide you some very specific feedback and let you know how you scored in certain areas and what could be improved to make your project even more competitive. So if you have applied before, maybe you didn't get a grant award, we highly encourage you to request that critique, and we can usually provide that to you pretty quickly. Also, I will be following up with each person on this webinar today via email to provide some supplemental handouts, and we'll also have a recording of this webinar available if you have coworkers or other folks in your network who weren't able to attend today. And last but not least, just a reminder, our very last in-person workshop will be in El Paso next week on Tuesday, October 3rd at Franklin Mountain State Park. So if you're in West Texas and you'd like to join us for a grant writing workshop in person, just let us know and we'll get you registered. We have space open at that workshop already. All right, part 2. You were emailed an electronic copy of the grant application. It's also under the handouts section if you want to follow along. In the prep and practice booklet on page 3, you can find the cover page of our 2024 co-op grant application. And we start out with just some general information about your organization. We do ask for a couple different identifiers, including your tax ID or EIN. If you are a nonprofit, you'll need to upload a copy of your IRS nonprofit determination letter. You will also need to upload a signed authorizing resolution. And that can look a little bit different depending on what type of organization you are. If you're from a municipality, that might be something where you have to go in front of your council and get signed. If you're working for a nonprofit, that might just be a director that signs that. But we also have some templates and examples available on the Argo resource tab, and I could send those to you as well. We also need what's called the unique entity identifier number. Carly referenced this earlier, and I just want to touch on a couple of points. If you already have this, fantastic. If you have no idea what this is, that's okay too. We'll give you some tips, and there is a quick start tutorial both on the SAM.gov website, and we can send that to you as well. But the unique entity identifier, or UEI number, it's required for all entities that are applying for funds through SAM.gov, the System of Award Management. So those of you who are familiar with previous applications, it's not the DUNS number. There really is no more DUNS number. Back in 2022, they instituted the UEI number. And really all you need to do is go on that website and apply for a number. You really don't need to fill out the full registration. Of course, you are welcome to do that if you intend on applying for federal grants or other things available on that website. But for co-op purposes, you really only need to apply for a UEI number. And the SAM.gov website has a downloadable tutorial. I noticed that they also have a video tutorial now, and they also have a live chat feature. So just a heads up, Carly and I don't work for SAM.gov. We don't have access to help you get a number or where you are in that application status. We can't really help you with that. But we can kind of walk you through that process of getting a number. And again, all you need to do is apply to get a unique entity ID only. You'll see that on the right side there. I kind of took it right from the website so you can see what box to check. It can take a while for some organizations. Some organizations we've seen get it fairly quickly, the number, and then some other organizations, sometimes they need additional documents, and it might take a couple of weeks. I think the longest I saw it take was maybe a couple months, and that organization just had some different complications and documents they needed to provide. So be sure and apply for that early and give yourself enough time to get that UEI number. And again, that website is sam.gov, and there is a tutorial on there as well as the video and live chat feature. So you should be able to get that fairly quickly. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at, in your booklet, it's going to be on page 4, and I'm on the second page of the actual application. If you've seen our past applications, it's fairly similar to applications in the past. But what I'm going to do is go through and give you some tips to try and make sure that your application is the most competitive it can be. Some places where occasionally we see people overlook certain elements or lose points on certain elements. So we're going to be pointing some of those out. So this section, the project information section, it's really kind of the heart of your application. It's asking for a lot of the really crucial details that help explain your project and your funding request. The first few parts are pretty basic about your organization's mission, your address, what Texas district you're in, if this is a new project or an existing project. And then you come to this portion of the application that asks about the key personnel in your organization that are directly involved with your grant project. And this may seem pretty simple, but I just want to point out a couple of tips here. You want to make sure that you're listing all the positions that are directly involved with your grant proposal project. Now, if you're hiring positions like interns, or you've created a position that you're asking for grant funding for, we'd still like you to go ahead and put in the title and the summary of their grant-related duties. But if you haven't hired those yet, under name, you can just put to be determined or to be hired. But it's very important that you're listing all the personnel that are involved with your grant project, especially if you're asking for grant funding to pay for some of those costs. So think ahead to your budget. If you're requesting grant funding for personnel, you absolutely need to make sure that they're listed in this front section. Again, even if you have a vacant position, please be sure and list it here. You don't have to put the name, you can just put to be hired, and then go ahead and fill in their grant related duties and qualifications. So this is just kind of a quick and easy way to ensure that you're getting all the points scored on your application and that it's aligned later on with your budget. Okay, we're going to move on. Next page, and we're going to look at the project description. So we're going to take a deeper dive into this. This is where a really large portion of your project is scored. This first section contains a brief summary of your proposal. It has the expected deliverables in the form of SMART goals, and then you'll also provide a detailed narrative that really has all the details, the who, what, why, where, and when, and how. The first tip I'd like to give is to just make sure that all of these elements are aligned. And that means that they're all matching throughout the timeline, throughout the budget, and throughout the narrative. There shouldn't really be a random SMART goal that lists a guided birdwatching event if you haven't already described that in your narrative section. But we're going to go ahead and break this down. Let's start with the project name. Just a little tip here that your project name, if you are awarded a grant, that goes out in our press release. And so we encourage you to have a good, solid, descriptive name for your project. If you just name your project Co-op Project 2024, when we have our press release, that's going to be the name of your project. So get creative, make sure you have a solid name for your project. The project overview, I like to think of this as like your elevator speech. It's just kind of the real down and dirty, brief overview of what you're proposing. So you're not necessarily going to put your organization's mission here or what you've done in the past. This is for anyone coming in, they should be able to read this short little description and understand what you're proposing in your grant application. The next piece are SMART goals. And if you haven't used SMART goals before, we do have in this prep and practice booklet, I believe it is on page 34. And we can also follow up and send this to you. But this is a tutorial on creating and writing SMART goals, and we're giving you lots of different examples. This might be the most misunderstood part that we see on an application. The SMART goals that you're writing are really the outcomes of your project. So they should be very specific, they should be very measurable, they should be attainable and realistic, and they should be somewhat timely or time bound. So they're really describing the measurable outcomes of your project, and we should be able to read your SMART goals and understand the deliverables of what you're proposing for your project. So it's really helpful if you include numerical goals. We give an example here. Coordinate 5 weekend camping trips in the spring to Houston area state parks, connecting 100 low-income female participants from Houston ISD to natural resources in Texas. So you can see from that example, it's very specific. It has some measurable elements to it, 5 weekends, 100 participants. It certainly is attainable and realistic. And then when we look at that goal, there's also a general timeline. We know that it's probably going to happen in the spring. So we've hit each element of that SMART goal. What you don't want to include are really vague terminology. For instance, if you're writing a goal that says, we will develop a generation of environmental leaders through education. You're missing a few pieces there, the specificity and measurability that's needed. So these SMART goals that we're creating in this section of the application, if you are awarded a grant, this is included in your grant agreement. So you want to be very realistic. As Carly mentioned earlier, what you're listing in these SMART goals, we will hold you to these SMART goals as your deliverables. If your project has multiple aspects, so let's say you're doing a couple family camping events, and maybe you're doing some school programs, and maybe you're doing a summer day camp program. Each one of those would need their own SMART goal. It's possible some proposals may have 5 or 6 SMART goals, and some proposals may just have 1 or 2. It really depends on your project. So refer to that SMART goal guidance document that's included for some good examples. This is a portion of the handout that you should have that describes what the specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely elements are in those goals. And I thought we'd take just a moment to do a little bit of practice. So what I've listed here are 3 different SMART goals. I'm going to give you just a moment to look over these. And I'm going to ask that you think about which one of these SMART goals gives the most accurate and measurable understanding of a project scope. So what we see here, A, it says the Wildlife Watcher Program will engage students in stewardship of the outdoors by inspiring healthy lifestyles while visiting 30 Texas state parks. So when I look at this goal and I'm applying the SMART goal format, I'm looking at a couple elements that are missing. When I look at this goal, I'm really not able to ascertain how many students are being served. I'm not really sure when they say they're engaging in stewardship, I don't have a very clear picture of what type of activities are happening. Also, when I see that their goal is to visit 30 Texas state parks, I really kind of question if that is an attainable goal and if it's realistic, and if that's happening over the full 18 months, or they're planning on doing that just in the spring or just in the fall. So I would say A is not a great example of a truly descriptive SMART goal. I'm going to jump down to letter C. Youth will successfully participate in the Shoot Safe Archery program by attending mentored practice sessions and participating in competitions. So if we look at this goal and apply those same SMART goal elements, again, we're missing a couple things here. Really, the specificity, how many youth, it says they'll successfully participate in the program, but I'm not really sure what the outcomes are, how many practice sessions, how many competitions, when this is happening. So there's a lot more details that could be added to this goal that would help meet those SMART goal criteria. And then finally, we're going to look at letter B. I would say this is a pretty strong example of a good SMART goal. It says, Outdoors for All will host a 4-day, 3-night family camping adventure during spring break at Cedar Hill State Park for 25 families. So we've hit all the elements. It's very specific. It has a measurable outcome. It has an approximate timeline, so it is kind of time bound. It's certainly attainable and realistic. So B would be a really great example of a SMART goal in your project proposal. Okay, we're going to jump into your project narrative. And I think it's really important to allot enough time for this portion of your application. In this portion of your application, think details. Think sharing who you're serving for each element of your project, where these activities are going to take place, what types of outdoor activities are incorporated, when and where, how long the activities will last. It's important for our review committee to really understand the depth of exposure and impact to score your application competitively. You know, if you have 100 participants who are engaging in a 2-hour program, or if you have 20 participants who are meeting monthly for 8 hours each month over the course of 10 months, that would be a much deeper exposure. So it's very helpful to include how long the activities will last, whether that's a half-day program or a full weekend or an overnight program. Also, how frequently your participants will be engaged, and if there are repeat participants or exposure. And we also want to know your risk management and what type of training. Carly mentioned things like hurricanes and weather. Of course, in the world today, we have things like COVID. You can talk about potential backup plans and kind of let us know some of your risk management plans. If you have really young kids in the water, are you going to have staff that are certified as lifeguards? Just that overall risk management plan as part of your project proposal helps give a strong assurance that you really thought that through and a strong assurance of the program being delivered. There's also a section here where you can talk about leadership development. Of course, that's not required, but that could be your volunteers. It could be training that's included for your staff or volunteers. It could be including information about conservation careers as part of your program or mentoring. It might be some of your participants actually getting certified in boater education or hunter education. And then you can also talk about any type of outdoor service project that your participants would be engaging in. But make sure that's a good fit with your project and it's not something you're just throwing in. Just mentioning a trash pickup isn't really going to qualify in this section for additional points. It would need to be something that's really thought out and well developed. So this project narrative is really your opportunity to showcase all the details and that you've really thought through all elements of your program. As Carly mentioned before, having some type of connection to TPWD resources or a relationship with TPWD staff or programs is a requirement for this grant, and that can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be visiting a state park, although many of our programs do. This could include visiting any type of TPW site, something like Sea Center, Texas, our wildlife management areas, any of our fisheries. It could also be participating in a training or certification program like our angler education or hunter education or Project Wild programs. We also have lots of outreach programs that can come directly to your site, like our Buffalo Soldier program. But the focus is really on the quality of kind of building that relationship and connection between your participants and having a continued relationship with Texas Parks and Wildlife. Now, some of these programs you could just sign up for online, like Boater Education or Project Wild. But if you are creating a project where your expectation is you're going to be working directly with a TPWD staff member, like one of our game wardens or urban biologists. If you are partnering with our Texas Outdoor Family Program, or if you're working with one of our programs to come directly to your site, we do recommend that you upload a commitment letter. It is required if you're working directly with TPWD staff. That way they have an idea of what your expectation is. And then if you receive the grant, you would reach out to them to actually schedule that visit or program. But it is very important, whether it's required or not, that you really touch base and understand the requirements of different relationships. So we do have a handout. It's the Direct Relationships Approved for Co-op Grants. And within that electronic handout, there's lots of live links to help you navigate and explore all of the programs and resources that we have available. We really value that deeper connection over time, and then also that repeat exposure that helps develop the quality of and potential to continue the relationship with Texas Parks and Wildlife. So again, we highly recommend a commitment letter and reaching out to some of these programs before you submit your proposal. And it is required if you are listing a specific TPWD staff member, partnering with our Texas Outdoor Family Program, or engaging specifically with an outreach program that you want to visit your site, like our Buffalo Soldier program. Those are all required to have a letter of commitment. Our staff are used to writing these letters, but please give them enough time. We do tell our coworkers that if they are contacted on November 1st at 4 o'clock to provide a commitment letter, that they are not required to provide a letter with such short notice. So get those requests in now, reach out to those contacts and programs now, and just make sure you give them plenty of time if you need that letter of commitment. If you're not sure what type of program or resource or site that could be incorporated in your grant project, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Carly, and we can brainstorm a little bit about some of these resources and how to integrate them into your program. We'd be happy to do that. All right, so once you've created your SMART goals and you've written your narrative where you're telling us all the who, what, where, when, and why, you have kind of figured out how you're going to incorporate your TPWD relationship. The next part of the application is a timeline. And this is a proposed timeline. Just a heads up, we understand that you are planning this really far out in advance. And so things can change, but we are looking to see that all elements of your application are described on this timeline. So if you have multiple elements, maybe archery training, maybe a day camp, and maybe a school program, we need to see all of these different elements on the actual timeline. And you can keep some of those tentative dates general, whether that's spring of 2025 or fall. We understand that making a reservation at a state park, it may not be a really specific date that you're able to list right now. But the location and the activities are an important part of that timeline. I will give a word of caution for new programs. If you are planning a lot of spring programs, just keep in mind that we announce those awards on March 1st. So I just want to caution you to allow yourself enough time. We can't fund any prior purchases for equipment or supplies before that date. Remember, you want to give yourself enough time to recruit participants. So it may be best, especially if you're starting a brand new program, to push some of those events later into the summer, into the fall, or even the following spring, as you have that whole 18 months to spend your grant funds. You want to make sure you're not putting lots of planning time or partner meetings on your timeline. We don't really need to see that. It's just the actual programs and project details that should be listed here on the timeline. We do offer a space to upload a program itinerary. It's certainly optional, but I like to encourage folks to think about this as an opportunity to provide our scoring committee with more details about your project. An itinerary can really help us determine, a sample of how that program might go and what elements are included. It helps provide more details about how your participants are engaged in a certain program. So if you're able to upload an itinerary, again, it's not required, but it's certainly recommended. Another big portion of the application are the participants that you will be serving. The mission of the co-op grant is to engage underrepresented audiences with TPWD resources and sites. So this is a really important part of your application. When you're thinking about the participants that will be served in your project, we're asking you to make an estimate of unduplicated participants. So you may have participants that are attending multiple events or monthly events, and that's great. We really value that repeat exposure, but the number that we're looking for here are unduplicated participants. And then we're going to ask you some questions on the application about your demographics. This demographics section is worth about 30% of the scoring. And again, this is the primary intent of the co-op grant. On the program guidance, I think it's on page 6, you can see that scoring criteria, and you will need to provide a breakout of your demographics. The underrepresented audiences that we intend to serve are racial and ethnic minorities, females, low-income individuals, and then individuals with disabilities. And I want to be really clear that the expectation is that you're not serving all 4 of these demographics. I would say we have very few projects that are hitting all 4 target audiences. You want to make sure that you are able to collect the demographic data that you're listing. So for some programs, if you've run past programs and have demographic data, that would be a great way that you can provide those estimates. If you are in a new program or you're partnering with another organization, you may be able to provide those demographics from a partner organization who collects similar demographics and is willing to share those demographics with you. If you're partnering with a school, you can find a lot of that and they're willing to share, but I will caution you, if you're working with one specific school, or maybe you're only working with one teacher and her class, so maybe 20 students, you want to make sure that your demographic data is specific to the students you're working with. So we wouldn't want you to list the demographics for the entire ISD if you're just working with one class at one school. We're going to ask that you kind of drill down a little bit to ensure that those demographics will meet the data that you proposed. Another successful way that projects have collected the demographic data is self-reporting. So if you have an opportunity for individuals to register for your program and to self-report on that registration, that would be another way to collect demographic data. And again, you don't necessarily need to hit every demographic category. We do have some groups that are a little more hesitant to ask about things like low income status for families, and some individuals are a little more hesitant to report that information. So if that's the case and you're not able to collect low income data, then you just wouldn't list or claim that on your application. We don't allow things like really general census data or zip code data or neighborhood data, just because it doesn't really allow a strong assurance that the participants you're serving are going to reflect that zip code or census data. We will ask on your application for a breakout of your participants' demographics and then an explanation for how you estimated those percentages. Again, you don't need to hit every single one of these, but you do need to give an assurance that those are the participants and percentages that you'll be serving in your program. We do ask if you are tracking that demographic data currently, and if not, how you'll be collecting some of that demographic data. If you're partnering with another organization, you can share some of their data, whether that's membership data, like the Boys and Girls Club, or maybe even a specific school. And again, if you don't have the means to collect specific demographics, you can just put a 0. If you are serving individuals with a disability, you are allowed to count any caretakers that are also expected to attend your programs. Those count towards that demographic information. And then if you look below, there is a section where you can upload a supporting letter if you are using demographic from a partner organization at the bottom where it says upload their commitment letter. So just keep in mind that very few projects receive points in all 4 categories. It is very important that you are kind of underestimating and over-delivering, if you will. We do hold you to these demographics that are listed in your application. And I will say that this section of the application is probably where we get the largest number of questions. And the answer to a lot of your questions are usually very specific to your organization. So if you have questions on how to complete this section, please don't let it be a barrier to having a successful application. We really encourage you to just contact us directly and we can kind of talk through some of the issues that you're having with demographics or how to collect them and record that breakout. So reach out and we can walk you through that. All right, last but not least, we're going to take a look at the project budget section of your application. Really important tip here is to allow yourself enough time to complete this section. This section does time out, so it's really important that you are saving as you work on this section of the application. Some folks have kind of given some tips that they work from a Word document and then are kind of transferring some of this information over. But it's important to refer to your program guidance as you're creating your budget. Page 6 is going to list what is actually eligible in your budget. If an item is disallowed, we'll need to remove that item. And you really don't have the opportunity to replace those funds with another item. So if you listed a motorboat under your budget and that was $10,000, we may award your grant, but we will remove that ineligible item, a motorboat, for $10,000, and you won't have an opportunity to replace that with something else. The first section details your personnel. Again, all personnel, they need to be directly related to your grant project, and they should be included in the first portion of your application where we listed out the key personnel in that application. We do require timesheets for reimbursement of personnel expenses. Now, if your organization doesn't utilize timesheets, we do have some templates that we can provide, but those are required for all employees that are seeking reimbursement for personnel costs. We also can reimburse for food and travel. We do encourage folks to use a federal mileage rate, like on the IRS website, versus issuing things like gas cards A mileage rate covers kind of wear and tear and gas, and that's just a federal rate that you can use to estimate. We can also pay for different fees and liability insurance. Just keep in mind you can't pay fees directly to yourself, and liability insurance would only be on participant liability insurance and not something like your property insurance or vehicle insurance. Another word about fees, we do encourage you to list out any type of state park or Texas Parks and Wildlife facility entry fees. Some superintendents will waive those fees, but it's not required. Every park is different. And even if you have a co-op grant, that does not mean that you have your park fees waived. So please list those out in your budget, as well as things like your group campsite fee or tour fees or any types of facility or program fees related to parks and sites. When we get down into supplies and equipment and service projects, we want to make sure that we keep those somewhat general. So you don't have to list out, if your program involves outdoor cooking supplies, you don't need to list out each element. So you don't need to list out a Dutch oven and a spatula and cooking oil and aluminum foil. You can just simply put outdoor cooking supplies, and those items would fall under that category. Same with things like fishing or archery. You don't need to kind of list out every single line item with bobbers and line and reels. You can just keep it general and list things like fishing equipment or archery equipment, and then that total amount. There is a section at the bottom of the budget where you can provide a deeper explanation if you think that's needed. But we do encourage you to keep some of that more general, if you will. Another tip on your project budget, make sure you go back into your application and you review your SMART goals and your project narrative to make sure that all of the activities in your budget match what you've written in your narrative and in your goals. Occasionally we'll see something kind of random in someone's budget. They'll mention something like archery supplies, but when we go back to the project description, there really wasn't anything mentioned about archery. So that alignment of your project and all of its different elements are really important, especially here at the end when we're looking at the funds you're requesting for your budget. We do have a sample budget available. I'm happy to send out some of those samples to you if needed, but this details just kind of a sample of what some of your personnel might look like. If you are using contractors for something like rock climbing or kayaking, any of your transportation supplies, whether that's renting a van or just reimbursing mileage. We have some of our fees here, whether that's training fees for your staff, and you can see there is liability insurance here in this sample. And you can see down at the bottom, the service, project, and other supplies are all kept fairly general. So mountain biking supplies, kayaking supplies, that would include your life jackets and paddles and kayaks and all those things under that one line item. Again, this budget does take a bit of time to complete, so just make sure you've allotted yourself enough time. We encourage everyone to start their application early. We highly caution against starting your application a day or two before the deadline of November 1st, and just be able to give yourself enough time. Okay, and this is our final checklist. Before you hit that submit button on your application, you want to make sure you have a signed and dated resolution and you're ready to upload that. You want to make sure you've reached out to any of the TPWD sites or staff or programs to just confirm maybe what their fees are, what their availability is, and if you need a letter of commitment. Make sure you're using that program guidance document to help really ensure your activities and your budget are eligible items for the grant. You can also add various members of your organization to your Argo account. So if you have a specific financial person who will be working on your budget or submitting reimbursements, if you are counting on a program person to submit your participant counts or quarterly reports or demographics, you can add all of those folks to your organizational account. And then just some final tips, just plan conservatively what you're writing in your application with your SMART goals and number of participants and demographics. Those are in your grant agreement if you're awarded. So we always say kind of under promise and over deliver. Make sure that your application is consistent and aligned throughout. I highly recommend that you have someone else review your application before you submit it. And then finally, every organization is different, and we encourage you to reach out to us for help. We are here to help. We're going to go ahead and list our contact information, both by email and by phone. We're available to talk through any of your project ideas or barriers that you come across in your application. We've had lots of comments and questions under the comments section in this webinar, but we're going to take a few minutes to go ahead and open up the questions to see if there are any other burning questions that we can answer for you guys right now. So we'll give you a few minutes, and I'm going to check in with Carly here and see if there's any burning questions that we can answer for folks.
Absolutely, and we'll still monitor the questions. So at this time, go ahead and put your questions into the question box. There are a few things that came up that I just want to mention to the whole group. So we did have some groups ask about what if your organization uses an umbrella organization that is out of state, or you need to go through somebody else. So a couple things to keep in mind. This is not a problem at all. We have many groups who use maybe a national entity and then they're the Texas chapter, or smaller groups who maybe don't have their own 501c3 go through an official nonprofit organization and use them as an umbrella organization. We do see that quite a bit. So that's not a problem, even if they're out of state. So if their national office is located in DC or New York or other places like that, but you're doing work in the state of Texas, that is no problem at all. A couple things to remember when that situation arises is that you need to put the information in the application. So the organization's name and the UEI number, their EIN number, all of those individual things for the legal entity that we will have a legal binding agreement with. So in those cases, typically our grant agreement will be issued to the national organization. Since they're the one that has an EIN number, they're going to sign up for that UEI. So I'm going to use, we have some like Audubon organizations that have to go through, let's say, a national organization. So in those cases, you would go through that national entity to apply, and then you would be applying for all of the work that's going to be happening in the state of Texas. So that's not a problem at all. If you have any specific questions related to that, by all means, reach out to us and we can provide you some assistance. Another point I wanted to make to expand on what Jessica had talked about with some of the superintendents, maybe waiving fees or some other things. We have seen in the past some of our grantees expect that if you receive a grantee, it automatically gives you certain privileges to partner with or use certain elements from within the agency. And we just really want to emphasize that we're our own department. We don't have any sort of privileges there. If you have a co-op grant, that does not automatically guarantee that one of our superintendents or park sites are going to waive any fees. It also does not guarantee that they're going to be able to provide services for you. You really need to make those relationships on your own. If you need help getting in touch with somebody, we will by all means make those connections for you. But please do not use having a co-op grant as an automatic ability to get in with a program, or, you know, we do hear sometimes people unfortunately say things like, well, I have a co-op grant, so you need to do this for me. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. So please keep in mind. Also, please keep in mind, this is very important, that our TPWD staff are very, very busy. They are often working in the field. They have a whole lot of requests to complete. So if you need a commitment letter from another individual, we often tell our staff that if you submit that request a day or two before it's due, do not honor that, because you really need to reach out to them with as much time as possible to request that. So give them 2 or 3 weeks notice at least. If you don't hear from them right away, you may want to follow up with them because they are very busy and emails can tend to get lost. So please reach out to those partners that you want well in advance to request those letters. We do have a couple questions coming in. Somebody's asking if this grant opportunity is offered every year. Yes, it is, as long as we have funding. You know, we always have to abide by what our budget is for that year, and if they somehow cut our budget, we might not provide funding. But typically this is an annual grant RFP, so we usually open up this RFP every August with a November deadline and then awards on March 1st. And so we do offer this once a year. So if you decide that your organization is just not ready to apply for a co-op grant this year, it will be open next year. Another person is asking if adapted bikes are okay to be used in parks or track and field as a race bike. Does that matter? So this might be a little bit of a complicated answer. With our particular grant program, our focus really needs to be things that are associated with Texas Parks and Wildlife. So if you're doing adaptive programs for mountain biking, you know, think about, like, would you be mountain biking on a trail? That's really the good connection to Texas Parks and Wildlife and what this program would really fund. So if you need hand cycles or adapted bikes for that program, by all means. However, if this is going to be part of just a general track and field event, that might not align as well with the mission of this grant. So we really have to think about these things and tie it back to, are these items that are, how can you relate it back to Texas Parks and Wildlife? The entire intent of this grant program is to diversify the audiences engaged with the agency. So if you're just doing general track and field exercises, being able to make that connection to the agency might be a little bit more difficult. We do support mountain biking activities or riding bikes and things like parks and bike activities, but you may need to separate that a little bit from just general track and field activities. And if that's something that we need to talk to on a case-by-case basis, by all means, give Jessica and myself a call. I'm not really seeing any other questions. So if you have any other questions, we're going to hang on just for another minute or so, and we'll answer those questions in the chat box. Otherwise, Jessica and myself will be available to answer your questions. Our entire job is to make sure that you have the most competitive grant application available. So we are not like a foundation where we're like, oh, please don't talk to us, don't bother us. By all means, our whole job is to help you out. We want to make sure that you're successful and have a competitive application. So please reach out to us if you have any questions at all.
Also, I'll be following up with all of you in a few days. I'll be sending the link to this webinar that has been recorded. If you need a refresher, if there was something you missed, if you need to share it with a coworker, I'll also be sending some supplemental documents, as well as another round of electronic documents that were available in the handouts today. So you can look for that email from me in a couple days once we have that link.
And we did have another question come in on if liability insurance, is it just for vehicle or travel or for individuals liability? We just wanted to let you know that you can only request participant liability insurance. We will not support liability, or we will not support insurance for vehicles or property or general, like directors and officers insurance. None of that is allowed. We will only accept requests for participant liability insurance. And that's because we want to make sure that you're covered. You're doing outdoor programs that come with a certain risk associated with that. We want to make sure that your organization is covered in case a participant or volunteer or staff person is injured during one of these events. So liability insurance is only allowed for participant liability insurance. Okay, and then it looks like we have another question coming in. For archery equipment, does this need to be used in parks then? If the intention is to practice a local business archery range and compete at different events, how might that be tied to Texas Parks and Wildlife? So all activities do not have to take place at a state park. You do have to have that one minimum connection to Texas Parks and Wildlife, but not all activities must take place. So if you have your own site, we often see like camps have their own site where they're doing many of their activities. That is completely fine. Just make sure that you have that TPWD relationship. So maybe you send your staff through the archery certification and then you implement that onto your own site. Also keep in mind that you must be whoever is applying for must be a tax exempt organization. So if it is the actual archery, for-profit archery range that is applying, that will not be eligible. But if your program is working with kids and you're working with them during practices, and then going to a few different archery, maybe competitions with them at somebody else's competition site, that is not a problem at all. All of those activities do not have to take place at Texas Parks and Wildlife. And if you have additional questions on that, by all means, reach out to Jessica and we can talk about your case-by-case situation. All right, so with that, I am not seeing, oh, wait, just kidding, there's some more questions come in. All right, so we have a program example here about an environmental science at a school, and they're wanting to take some environmental kids to go camping. So by all means, that is an eligible activity, and if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to us. So,
and you can reach out to us, and I can tell you that if you're looking for TPWD resources or relationships for that type of program, we have different curriculums like aquatic science and Project Wild that you could offer staff training. We have, of course, parks that have all different types of overnight facilities. We have our Texas Outdoor Family Program that partners with kind of guided camping experiences. So we have plenty of different resources and connections that would be aligned with that type of program.
And with that, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but I just want to wish everybody here the best of luck when applying for this grant application. We really hope you're successful and we look forward to reading more about your programs. Please, you do not have to be a professional grant writer to apply for this grant, so please don't be discouraged if you do not receive a grant in this first year. It's a very competitive grant program, so we have many people who do not get it in their first year, and that's completely fine. It says nothing about your particular program, it's just that we don't have enough money to fund everybody. So if you do not receive a grant this year, please do not be discouraged. We highly recommend you request an application critique for your proposal, and Jessica and I will give you a full critique, tell you exactly how you score, and then provide you individualized recommendations for how it might be more competitive in the future. So please utilize that option, and then don't hesitate to come back in the following year. And we see many, many groups who don't get it their first year, and then they come back and they get a grant, and it's wonderful. So don't be discouraged. Reach out to Jessica and I if you need anything else. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this webinar. And I really appreciate all of the time you spent with us today. Thank you so much.